I finished up on The Sopranos in, I guess, the spring of 2007. My then girlfriend, who was since become my wife, was pregnant. I moved back to LA. I gave up my apartment here. We went into this nesting period and a rented house in Century City. My son was born, and then it was a question of, okay, well, what next? And it was a very leisurely period for me, where I was starting to figure out what the next move is going to be. And of course, the idea was going to be to develop something for HBO. And I really wasn't quite sure what. I kicked around a couple of ideas, and then at one point, Carolyn Strauss called me and said, we have this book called Boardwalk Empire. It's essentially the history of Atlantic City. And why don't you read it and see if you think there's a series in there? Carolyn Strauss was the president of HBO Development at that time. And I was like halfway out of her office, and she said, oh, by the way, Martin Scorsese is attached to this. And somewhere over there, I have the buck slip that I found in my copy of the book that said, hey, Terry, here's the HBO thing. Here's the Marty Scorsese thing I was telling you about. It was Boardwalk Empire. So I said, well, there is definitely a series in here in that case. I don't even have to read the book. Scorsese was truly the reason I got interested in film in the first place. I think I told you before, Taxi Driver was the first movie I ever saw that really actually got me thinking about movies. I mean, I went out of that and said, wow, that was not like other movies. Why is this different? So years later, the idea that I might be working with him or have an opportunity, I went home and I told my wife, I've just been given a TV series. I said, if I figure this out, this is a TV series. Because if Martin Scorsese is attached to this and I do my job, they will make it. So it's not like I'm going to be jockeying for a shot here. I just have to not screw this up. So I read the book, and it is it's a fairly dry account of the history of Atlantic City. I mean, it's entertaining if you like history, but it's not like a novel. So there were a couple of eras that interested me. There were the 20s, the Prohibition era, the 50s, which was like the Skinny D'Amato, Dean Martin era, and then the 70s when gambling was introduced. 70s felt too much like The Sopranos, felt like Tony's dad. The 50s felt like it had been done a lot. But the Prohibition era had not really been done on TV since The Untouchables and like the old Warner Brother gangster movies. And I thought, this is an interesting time period. And then there was this guy, Nucky Johnson, who was, we later fictionalized as Nucky Thompson, who was the guy who was the corrupt politician who ran Atlantic City. So he's like half politician, half gangster. And I said, this is the guy we set the series around. So Carolyn said, all right, great. I'm going to set up a meeting with you and Martin Scorsese. You're going to go to his house for dinner and talk about the show. So I was like, I thought I died. I'm going to have dinner at Martin Scorsese's house. So I was like, yeah, it's 9:30 at night on Tuesday. I said, wow, it's a little late to have dinner, but I guess I had heard he's a night owl. Maybe, he eats late. So, I was like a girl going to the prom. What should I wear? What wine to bring? I was like, I got there like 20 minutes early, like walking around the block. I was like, exactly 9:30. I ring the doorbell, and Marty's wife answers and says, oh, come on in. So we're walking in, and I'm walking up the stairs, and she says, oh, Marty had oral surgery. I said, oh, really, when? She goes, this afternoon. I went, oh, okay, well, that's not great. We're going to have dinner, and, So I sit, and I'm waiting, and in his parlor, and he's got his, Oscar and all these awards, and it's just, like, incredible. And he comes out, and it was like he has, like, a comic ice pack on his face. It looks like something you see in a cartoon. He really just had surgery. And first thing he said to me was, I can't really talk, and please don't make me laugh. And I went, okay. This meeting is like really going down the tubes already. So we sit down, and I said, well, here, I have some wine. He said, oh, thank you. And this kind of awkward moment, he gives the wine to his wife, and I'm all right, and waiting for dinner. And we sit down, and we start talking, and 20 minutes into it, I realized that this is not, in fact, a dinner meeting at all. I was told it was a dinner meeting, but it's not. It was just a meeting, and I show up like an idiot with a bottle of wine. So, like, he's kind of must think I'm nuts, So we finally get to the point where Carolyn had told me he's going to pitch you on some ideas for the show. So we finally get the small talk out of the way, and I said, so you're going to pitch me on some ideas for the show? And he went, no, I don't do that. I was like, of course you don't, you're Martin Scorsese. And I'm supposed to pitch you, and I didn't have anything. I was just so flustered, and I finally said, well, you know what? I've been thinking about the 1920s. Well, that's interesting. And then we just hit on this thing about the Prohibition era and the 20s, and talked for like an hour and a half about it. And by the time I walked out of there, that was what the show was going to be. So I called Carol, and I said, thank you. First of all, that was not dinner, and he was not pitching me. Because forget about that. He really likes the 1920s, and I'd like to run with that. So I went off, and the idea originally was that he was going to produce the show. He'd lend his name, executive produced by Martin Scorsese. So I went off, and I don't know, I guess it took me about 6 weeks or so, because I had a lot of research to do about the 20s, pop culture, World War I, the temperance movement, prohibition. There's so much stuff before I felt comfortable writing for people in 1920. I finally did. I wrote the pilot. I read novels, I read the Dos Passos novels, I read anything written in the time period, newspapers, magazine articles, movies. Movies were tough because a lot of the movies were made later and they were depictions of what the 1920s was, but not real. I tried to find film from the 20s. All kinds of history books about the various aspects of the show, the war, temperance, prohibition, like I said. So just that's 1/10 of what I have we have a library down the hall of all kinds of stuff. So I just read as much as I get my hands on. So I wrote the pilot. I turned it in, and I met with Marty again, and he said, I think I want to direct this. And I almost fell out of my chair. I went, oh my God. I said, great. And he goes, well, how do we move this forward? And I said, well, I'll tell you what. If you call the head of HBO and tell them what you just told me, I'm pretty sure this is going to move forward at the speed of light. And he said, okay, great, I'll do that. So the next day, I left there. I think I texted Richard Plepler, president of HBO. I said, Martin Scorsese wants to direct the pilot. And I got exclamation points back, oh my God, and then it was this was huge. So suddenly he was directing the pilot, and it was a question now of okay, how do we actually physically do this? When I was writing the pilot, it was really challenging because the more research on Atlantic City I did, the more it was crystal clear that this was impossible to do. I think I described the Atlantic City Boardwalk as Times Square on the ocean circa 1920. This is impossible. This doesn't exist anymore, and we can't build it. But there was a behind-the-scenes segment of the miniseries John Adams, and they did a show about all the visual effects that they could do. And I'd seen the miniseries, and I had no idea half of this stuff was visual effects, and I saw what they could do. Paul Giamatti walking down the street, and suddenly Boston circa 1775 appears behind him. And I went, wow, we actually might be able to pull this off. So we hired that company to then do our VFX. And what we ended up doing was, after scouting locations all over the place, we ended up realizing Brooklyn was the place we could do it. We would build a 300-foot replica of the Atlantic City Boardwalk, which we would then augment with visual effects and make it look like there's an ocean there, and the boardwalk will go on for miles, and it'll be done that way. And that's how we did it.